what this video is about is, before the war, what the state of affairs was in the German camera industry, and what happened after the war, and how the German camera industry was taken over by both the Russians and the Western powers, and basically an attempt was made to destroy it, which in the end turned into the opposite really, and the Western created multinational corporations all failed in West Germany, and in Russia things never really evolved too much, and in fact the only winners in the end were the Japanese. And so, to start at the beginning, I'm going to take a pause. Around about 1905, something like this, one of the leading businessmen in the chemicals industry, I think it was, went over to America to see how they organized, I think it was Shell, I think they called it Standard Oil back in those days, and some of the other big multinational corporations, how they created monopolies. And he came back with enthusiastic about the idea of creating global corporations, internationalized and so on. And so he went and talked to a number of the biggest corporations, biggest companies in Europe really, and gathered them together to form the big monopoly, which became I can't remember it. I wonder why. I better check my notes. Well, I don't have any. I better check the internet. Okay, IG Farben. And IG Farben ultimately became the most controversial international corporation that was taken to court by the Nuremberg trials, the only company to be taken to court at the Nuremberg trials. And there's an interesting story to be told about that. I'll talk about that later. But anyway, the company IG Farben and the groups of businessmen gathered together to monopolize all the industries in Germany. And the camera industry was one of the industries that were monopolized, but it was heavily connected with the chemical industry. As you know, Eastman Kodak, they were the big chemical industry, if you like, for the photographics all over the world really. They made film to use, sold all over the world, and they used to standardize the film sizes so that, you know, this was a kind of another way of monopolizing everything through standardization and control of patents and things like that. And so there was the Schneider group, and Schneider, Voigtlander, Zeiss, Ikon, all these companies came together into one company before the war. In the 1930s, they were making cameras based upon the Comper shutter, which is the shutter that's in this camera, the Voigtlander camera, as the Comper shutter. This is an example of a single lens reflex with a Comper shutter, but before the single lens reflex, they were making cameras with the Comper shutter. Now, the other camera company that was around at the time was Leitz. Leitz was making, in the 1930s, the Leica, and this is basically what the Leica would look like, but this ended up after the war. This was made on, it's a bit confusing, this one ended up after the war in Russia, or the Soviet Union. This one was made as a copy of the Leica in the Ukraine, which is part of the Soviet Union of the time. And this is what a Leica would look like. Leica 2 or Leica 3, as it eventually became. And during this period from the 1930s up until the war, really, there was very little innovation in the camera industry, because the Leica had basically been the same object for many years and hadn't evolved any further. Yet after the war, the Leica did evolve, and also the Contax evolved into the Pentacon, okay, or the Contax S and D. And so, and also, of course, the Japanese came into the market and produced the Nikon. Okay. And this heightened competition, if you like, caused the camera industry to evolve rapidly after the war. Because before the war, it was all a monopoly and everything was held back by patents, really. Now, when the Allies invaded Germany, they had in mind a plan to take over Germany, take over the industries in Germany, and control all the multinational corporations. And IG Farben was the biggest company in Europe and the biggest chemical company in the world. Okay, so it was very important for the big multinationals, globalists, to take over this company and control it. And so they planned not to destroy the big headquarters building. I'll put a picture of this up in Frankfurt, and they didn't bomb it, they left it standing. And then after the war, they made this building the supreme Allied headquarters at IG Farben. And after the first set of Nuremberg trials, what they did was they put the directors of IG Farben up to trial for war crimes. The chemical industries were involved in pesticides and experimentation, both animal and human, all sorts of things that the chemical companies did and still do today in various parts of the world. It was no different in Germany, really. And so it was a whitewash, really, because in the end they sentenced these people to, it took a year for the trial, and some of them were sentenced to a year imprisonment with time already served, so they didn't actually serve any time because they'd already spent 12 months through the trial process. And most of them were freed, I think all of them were freed after the trial, and so shortly after the trial, and the IG Farben was put into receivership and sold off to the same people. The directors of IG Farben bought back the company together with the multinationalists, and they split up IG Farben into a number of pieces, and these pieces were taken over and by the same people, the directors who were charged of committing war crimes. And the main player, the guy that was the head of IG Farben, ended up on the board of Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank was a bank created with a new currency, and had control over who got the money to develop in Germany in the future, West Germany anyway. So IG Farben was in the Western sphere of influence, and Germany was broken up into four pieces. There was the eastern part was controlled by the Soviet Union, and then the western part was controlled by, in three pieces, one was the British, one was American, one was French. And these three pieces on the western side were joined together and proclaimed a separate country and given a new currency, and the same thing happened over in the east. The German Democratic Republic was proclaimed in the eastern Germany, and so that was the start of what we call the Cold War. Now, having set up headquarters at IG Farben and created all this new country from IG Farben, it was actually created from IG Farben. All the documents were signed at IG Farben and everything.
Where is the door?
Just want to look, before we continue, about what happened on the other side, because if we look at that first, we'll see a similar thing happened in the west. In the eastern side, the Russians, all of the factories had been bombed and destroyed. In Dresden had been destroyed after the war, and so the Russians came in and told the Germans, basically in East Germany, that they had to set up new factory for production of the Contax camera, which is this camera. But this is the camera that was taken to Russia, to the Ukraine actually. And it's called a Kiev, and Kiev because it was built in Kiev, in the Ukraine. And so what the Germans did was, under the leadership of the USSR, was they set up a complete working factory again, all the machinery that needed to be made, and they made the factory, set it all up with the workers and everything, and started to produce this camera in East Germany, in Dresden, where it always was produced. And when it was all ready and tested and it was all working, they took the whole thing, lock, stock and barrel, the machinery, the workers, and the scientists that created and everything, and they moved the whole thing, lock, stock and barrel, to the Ukraine, and as like war booty, and set it up in Ukraine. And this is where this camera comes from. It comes from that factory in Ukraine, and it is exactly the same as a pre-war Contax, or the Contax which was made in Dresden in the war. It's exactly the same as that camera. In fact, the parts are interchangeable with that camera. And I don't think I'm open to a correction, but I don't think it was evolved. It was just simply continued to be manufactured in Russia. Because if you think about it, they didn't have the internet in those days, and the camera was the main tool of the CIA, you know, and the intelligence community. Things were photographed. When they talk about surveillance, they had bigger cameras with bigger negatives to give more detail. They used to use those for aerial reconnaissance and things. So the camera was a strategic asset in those days, in a similar way to which I suppose the computer is today. And so it was an important part of the strategy moving forward to ensure that there were sufficient cameras. And of course the press needed cameras and everything for their propaganda purposes, and so it was important to get this kind of camera, which is perfect for this use, into production. Now the Russians already had this camera. This camera was the Fed camera, which was a copy of the Leica. This was already being produced in the Ukraine. And there was another camera. Oh no, that comes later. Okay, so we'll leave it at that. And so to be careful about this, with this fed into the Ukraine. I think it's the Ukraine. I'll just talk USSR at the moment because then I can get my facts right. Okay, where are we up to? I'll take 5. Okay, now we've got the 3 Russian Leica equivalent cameras here, if you like. And what happened as the Germans moved towards Russia, the Fed factory, this is a factory that was making these cameras, the Fed factory was in danger of being overtaken by the war, and they didn't want it to fall into the hands of the Germans, and so they moved all of the machinery, equipment and the work there, they just like brought them out of the Ukraine, which is part of the USSR, and took them to set up a new factory, the KMZ factory. I think it's near Moscow, somewhere up there, in the USSR anyway. And they started to produce the Fed cameras there, and they also evolved the Zorki camera. What happened was they produced the Fed cameras, they evolved the Fed camera into the Zorki, and after the war they moved the production back to Fed, and so Fed carried on making the cameras there, and the evolved camera, the Zorki, was built at the KMZ factory that was left behind for them. So they ended up then with 3 places that manufactured rangefinder cameras. This one, which was the Contax, which was made in Kiev, and this one, the Fed, was also made in the Ukraine, and the Zorki 4 was made at the KMZ, where they made the Zenith camera, single lens reflexes and so on. And so the various cameras were aimed at different parts of the population. This camera here was made for the normal consumer camera, and what a great consumer camera this is. This camera works really, really great. Sounds beautiful. It's as good as a Leica, really. Better, actually. I used to own a Leica 3, and this thing is far more, far nicer. The thing works beautifully on it. The rangefinder works great, everything. And so, this of course is just like the German model. And the Zorki, well, the Zorki, I was hoping that the Zorki might have a better viewfinder, but I don't know. It's bigger viewfinder, but I prefer the viewfinder in this one. And so the Zorki 4 is an evil. I think this is this was produced quite late. This one is, the serial number gives you the year on these cameras, and this was made in 1973. So they made these kind of cameras quite late in the day, really. Okay, so that's the rangefinder production in Russia. And so this left the people back in Dresden to begin again. They had to make a new factory for themselves. They already made one, took it away, had to rebuild the other factory where the Pentacon was eventually produced. But before we get to that, let's go back to the West and talk a bit more about what happened there. Okay, now in the West, a similar thing was happening to Leica, and it's not documented anywhere really because it's politically incorrect to sort of be seen to have been doing what happened in East Germany and taking all the cameras into Russia and everything. It's not really, the West doesn't want to be seen to have done that, but reading between the lines, I'll tell you what I've found out about it, because there was a strange person involved in Leica just after the war, and this man was, You know, I can never remember his name, and whenever you can't remember somebody's name, it's the devil himself. And I just keep forgetting this person's name. I know his surname was, oh, I can't even remember that. I'm going to have to look it up. Hang on a minute. Okay, you've got it. Walter Cluck. What a name. Not click as the camera goes, cluck, cluck, you know, the eggs. Now, Walter Cluck was a German who had been in occupied France, somehow involved there, and anyway ended up on the Eastern Front after where he was bombed out by the Allies. And in the end of the war, he, instead of surrendering to the Russians, he made a escape out of that area into the hands of the Americans, and ended up in an American prisoner of war camp, and worked his way up from there with the Americans to be an interpreter. So if you like, he went onto the side of the Americans and helped the Americans take over Germany after the war. And he was at, again, I can't remember, it's the devil himself. I have to do this again. Okay, here we go. I.G. Farben. Why can't I remember this name? So he worked as an interpreter for the management of I.G. Farben as it sought to, I suppose, control factory and so on. And they also had an unusual sort of situation where it was almost like a pawn shop where people took all their valuables and the American forces took them off them and gave them a piece of paper that allowed them to get other stuff instead. And so he was at this place and somehow got through this, ended up, you know, probably saw a lot of cameras coming in, thought, yeah, and everybody wanted cameras. And so he ended up becoming involved in lights. So as part of his connection with I.G. Farben, lights, some of the equipment was moved out of lights. Apparently the story is in the middle of the night. I don't know. You don't know what they're trying to cover up here. But anyway, the machinery and stuff was moved from lights into the French occupied zone on the Saar, I think it was. And so Saarland or somewhere like this. And because I suppose there's a French connection there, you know, parts of the French wanted something, and I suppose Leica was, say, well, we'll have this, you can have lights or something, dividing everything up. And so this man, he only worked or was associated with lights for 1 year already, and he'd taken his factory out. He probably supervised the creation and movement of this factory into Saarland. And then they produced Leicas in Saarland for a while and fed them out into the international community, bypassing certain import restrictions on German goods. And then he was a man who was responsible for taking the Leica factory over and creating a new factory in Canada, and French associated with Canada, France, Canada, you know, it was the same sort of thing as what happened with in Russia. So that's how Leicas ended up being made in Canada. Now, at the time, the Cold War was on, and so they didn't know if Russia was going to take over the West Germany. You know, it could have developed into a proper war, and Russia take over West Germany. And so they wanted to get the cameras out of Germany into some other, and I think this is the reason that they took them to Canada, because Leica was a very important camera. You know, the West needed access to that particular camera. And a lot of effort was put into the Leica development after the war, and because these cameras were coming, and so they needed to come up with something that was better than the old Leica that had been changed since the 1930s. And so, not in any significant degree. And so they developed in 1954 the Leica M3. And so the Deutsche Bank would have been responsible for ensuring that they had the funds and the expertise and that they were got from the internationalists and the globalists to get that Leica M3 going. But, and so the next thing is to get back to is what happened with the other German camera manufacturers based around the composite shutter, because the Leica was based on a cloth focal plane shutter and the other cameras were based around the composite shutter. And these were all the multinationalists who were involved in this. So that was Kodak, Agfa, Voigtlander and Zeiss Ikon. And Zeiss Ikon had a factory set up in West Germany at Oberkochen, where they made some of the lesser quality, no, not lesser quality, but they were aimed at the general populace in the same way that the Feds were aimed at the general populace. They weren't as highly specified and or as expensive as the Leicas. And so, because after the war, the main camera industry, Zeiss and the great camera builders of Dresden, ended up in the Eastern Soviet sphere, there was no real Zeiss, there was no Zeiss really in the Western sphere, just the remains of an old, not a significant factory there. What they did was they created a fake Zeiss, and they tried to say that the East German firm was fake, and they started to fight all sorts of court case battles to try to eliminate Zeiss as a competitor. So both Zeiss and the cameras that they made, which was the Contax camera, which is what this is. This is a new Contax. We'll talk about it in a minute. And so Zeiss Ikon in the West Germany developed together with Voigtlander. They took over Voigtlander, and Voigtlander became the lens making arm, and they used to make Voigtlander lenses and put Zeiss name on it, you know, because the real Zeiss lenses were made in Jena in East Germany.